Mark Evans sat alone in Café Lumiere, tapping his foot against the polished floor. A sleek suit emphasized his confident posture, and the quiet murmur of upscale patrons blended with the soft notes of jazz from hidden speakers. He glanced at his phone. No new messages, then slid it aside with a sigh. His best friend Jake had talked him into this blind date, insisting it would be good for him. Yet all Jake really said was, "She's not your usual type. Go meet her. You might learn something." Vague and slightly ominous. It left Mark dreading an awkward evening. He sipped his cappuccino and considered leaving. In the past, any mention of "not your usual type" meant someone who wouldn't fit the glossy model image Mark usually dated. Despite feeling restless, guilt held him in his seat. If he ducked out, Jake would tease him forever. Maybe he could endure an hour, then politely bail. Moments later, the cafe door chimed. Mark glanced over, then felt an unexpected twist in his stomach. A tall woman with soft auburn hair stepped inside, scanning the room with cool composure. She wore a simple yet tasteful dress that flattered her figure without being flashy. When she spotted him, she gave a small, warm smile. Mark rose automatically, the script in his mind dissolving. This was definitely not the unremarkable or plain person he'd pictured. "Mark?" she asked, voice quietly confident. He nodded. "Sarah?" She set her purse on the table and extended a hand. "Nice to meet you." They took their seats, and Mark couldn't help but notice the subtle assurance in her posture, a far cry from the timid presence he'd expected. "Jake said you were different," he offered, feeling sheepish. "But I think he undersold you." She laughed softly. "I'm guessing he said I'm not your type?" Mark shrugged, a little embarrassed. "Something like that." Sarah's eyes danced with amusement. "Well, let's see if I can break your expectations." Then, they ordered coffee, and to Mark's surprise, the conversation flowed. Instead of small talk about the weather or generic job chatter, Sarah spoke about her love for publishing. She worked as an editor, guiding authors to refine their stories. Mark listened, intrigued by her enthusiasm. He found himself asking questions, wanting to learn how she discovered hidden talent, how she balanced creativity with deadlines. Usually, on first dates, Mark performed, bragged about his finance career, the big clients, the fancy offices. Yet with Sarah, he hardly mentioned it. She felt real in a way that made him care about more than appearances. "So," she said, stirring her latte, "Jake implied you're some big financial hotshot. That must mean you're busy all the time." Mark gave a modest shrug. "It's mostly spreadsheets, phone calls, and stress. Doesn't sound as glamorous when you boil it down." She tilted her head, studying him. "Is that why you agreed to this date? You needed a break from it all?" He chuckled. "Jake claimed it was a social experiment. Maybe to pop my comfort bubble. I expected, well, I'm not sure. But not this." He gestured to her wryly. "You're definitely not dull or awkward." Sarah's smile flickered. "People assume I'm boring just because I'm not a glamour queen. High school was tough. I got pinned as the average one who'd never stand out. Sometimes labels stick." A pang of remorse hit Mark. He recalled how quickly he'd braced himself for disappointment. "They definitely got it wrong," he said gently. They spoke about her dream of someday opening a bookstore cafe, a quiet haven for readers. Mark found the idea beautiful. "Cozy spots are underrated," he admitted. Sarah teased him about stepping away from finance to brew cappuccinos. He laughed, finding the notion bizarre yet strangely appealing. It felt refreshing to engage with someone who valued substance over superficial sparkle. After an hour, Mark realized he was in no hurry to leave. She was thoughtful, bright, and had an understated self-confidence. Still, a sliver of doubt lodged in his mind. His circle prized appearances, status. Sarah wasn't that typical model date he paraded around at events. Could he handle not conforming to those norms? When the check arrived, he insisted on paying. She insisted they split. He convinced her to let him treat her this once. "You can get the next round," he joked, surprising himself with how eager he was for a second outing. Outside, the chilly air brushed them both. She paused, hugging her coat close. "Thanks for tonight," she said, eyes shining. I had fun. I did too, Mark replied, sincerity creeping into his voice. Would you want to do this again sometime? Maybe a walk or dinner? Her hesitation was brief before she smiled. Sure. Why not? They exchanged a warm goodbye, and Mark watched her disappear into the swirl of city lights. His heart buzzed with unexpected excitement. This was supposed to have been a throwaway evening, but Sarah had disarmed him in the best possible way. A week slipped by. Between conference calls and scouring investment reports, Mark caught himself thinking about Sarah, her easy laugh, her intelligent gaze. He texted her every couple of days, forging a friendship that felt exhilarating. Jake pestered him about it. Dude, you actually like her? Mark half laughed, half glared. Yeah, I do. Jake couldn't resist teasing. Well, I'm surprised. She's not exactly a runway model. Irritation flared in Mark. She's beautiful in her own way, he snapped. To his own surprise, he realized he meant it. Jake apologized, but the damage was done. Without thinking, Jake mentioned the date had started as a bet, an attempt to see if Mark, the picky bachelor, could handle someone less glamorous. Mark paled. You told Sarah that? Jake gave him a sheepish grin. Might have slipped out. Sorry, man. Didn't think it was a big deal. Mark's gut twisted. It's a huge deal. She's going to be furious. He ended the call and tried phoning Sarah. No response. He texted, we need to talk. No reply. His greatest fear was that she'd feel betrayed. Sure enough, the next day, Mark rushed to the small bookstore where Sarah worked. He spotted her behind the counter, but when their eyes locked, she turned sharply and walked into the back room. He followed, ignoring curious customers. Sarah, wait, he pleaded. She spun around, arms folded. A bet. Mark? That's why you went out with me. His heart pounded. I swear. It started off that way, but everything changed once I met you. I promise. This us means more to me than that stupid dare. Her eyes were a storm of hurt. How do I believe that? You lied from the start. Mark's voice shook. I know, and I hate myself for it. But the moment I saw you, realized who you were, the bet meant nothing. I didn't want to lose what we had by telling you. Please, Sarah, let me show you it's real. She looked away, blinking back tears. Finally, she whispered, prove it, and brushed past him, leaving him alone among the shelves. Over the next few days, Mark tried to show her how sorry he was. He left notes, funny, heartfelt scribbles, where he knew she'd find them. In a stack of books, on her desk, even slipped under her apartment door. He admitted how enthralled he was by her humor, her resilience, how she wasn't swayed by superficial nonsense. Meanwhile, Sarah wrestled with her own emotions. Part of her wanted to slam the door on him forever. Another part recalled how genuine he'd seemed on their dates, how he listened and admired her. Maybe he'd changed, but trust once broken was hard to rebuild. Finally, Mark asked her to meet him again at the very same table in Café Lumière. She arrived, guarded but calm. He stood up to greet her, voice trembling with relief. Thank you for coming. She Saturday, arms folded. Talk. He took a steadying breath. I can't undo the bet, but from our first conversation, I realized you're amazing, smart, creative, kind, everything I'd been missing. I was stupid not to be honest. Why not tell me right away? She asked, anguish creeping into her voice. Fear. I didn't want you to think I only stuck around out of pity or guilt. I realized I wanted something real with you, so I hid the bet. That was wrong. Sarah exhaled slowly. I'm hurt, really hurt, but part of me believes you. Mark reached across the table, not quite touching her hand. Let me prove it, with no shallow goals or bets. I want to see where this goes, if you'll let me. She studied his face. After a tense moment, she sighed. You realize this will take time, right? I won't just forget everything. I'll wait as long as it takes, he said, voice quiet and earnest. A flicker of a smile touched her lips. Then let's start over. No more illusions. Relief broke across Mark's features. Thank you, he whispered. I promise I won't mess this up. They finished their coffees. Not exactly cheerful, but on the cusp of a new beginning. The betrayal still lingered between them, but so did a spark that refused to die. Outside, the city lights glowed softly as they walked side by side, exchanging tentative conversation. There was no grand flourish, no romantic speech, just two people trying to rebuild trust. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, Mark learned how to be patient. He reined in his usual bravado, choosing to show Sarah that he wasn't fixated on image. They spent quiet nights discussing books, or strolling through a local park, or lingering in her tiny apartment kitchen while she tried new recipes. He discovered that beneath his once arrogant exterior, he craved simplicity and sincere connection. Meanwhile, Sarah allowed small glimpses of her vulnerability. She'd share stories of insecure teenage years, how she felt overshadowed by more outwardly flashy peers. Mark listened intently, wishing he could have shielded her from that pain. Their friends noticed the shift in Mark's demeanor. Jake teased him about being whipped, but Mark retorted, "I just found something real, and it's a hell of a lot better than shallow hookups." Jake gave him a half-sheepish apology, admitting he'd misjudged Sarah, too. Sarah's co-workers teased her gently as well, marveling at the difference between the aloof businessman they'd envisioned and the earnest, supportive partner he'd become. She remained cautious but no longer chilly. She wanted to give Mark the benefit of the doubt, especially when he consistently respected her boundaries and championed her goals. One evening, Mark invited Sarah to a small gathering of his corporate friends. She felt a twinge of anxiety. She'd never quite meshed with the high-flying crowd. But Mark insisted, "They'll love you," in a tone that suggested he was unafraid of how they'd judge him for bringing someone not cut from typical trophy girlfriend cloth. True to form, Sarah was initially nervous. The chatter about hedge funds, real estate developments, and designer brands bored her. Still, she held her ground, and Mark introduced her with pride, ignoring any subtle looks. Over the course of the evening, a few people were visibly intrigued by Sarah's grounded attitude. She didn't fuss over which label she wore, or how prestigious her job was. She simply listened, asked thoughtful questions, and made them laugh with her dry wit. Jake approached them, a wry grin on his face. "Well, I see the experiment turned out differently than expected." Mark glared but softened when he felt Sarah squeeze his hand. "Yes, it did," Mark answered. "Better than I ever imagined." Jake shook Sarah's hand, looking momentarily sheepish. "I'm sorry if I gave you a weird impression. Mark's a good guy. He just needed a push to see it himself." Sarah smiled politely, not quite ready to call Jake a friend, but it was a start. That night, as Mark escorted her home, the city glittered around them. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "You handled that crowd like a pro." She let out a breathy laugh. "They weren't so bad. Maybe I was scared for nothing." He wrapped an arm around her. "You're amazing," he said, then hesitated. "I'm sorry again for everything that caused you pain. Sometimes I can't believe you gave me a chance." She looked up at him. "You took time to prove you meant what you said. I see that effort." He released a small sigh of relief. "Thank you." Months passed in a gentle rhythm, each day strengthening their bond. Mark discovered that real affection came from shared honesty, not shallow illusions. He watched Sarah chase her dream of opening a bookstore cafe, scribbling business ideas on a notepad. He offered to help with finances, but she was fiercely independent, insisting she wanted to do as much as she could on her own. He respected that, stepping in only when invited. They often returned to Café Lumière, the site of their first meeting. Neither forgot the tension and assumptions from that initial night, but now it felt like a place symbolizing second chances. On one particular evening, Mark proposed they recreate that first date. Same table, same drinks, minus the old prejudices. Sarah laughed at the suggestion. "Should I walk in late and pretend to be a total stranger?" He grinned. "Hey, it might be fun." They didn't quite go that far, but they did sit in the same corner, sipping cappuccinos and reminiscing about how he'd been sure the night would be a flop. She teased him for fidgeting and expecting to dash out within 20 minutes. "You were so certain I'd be boring or awkward," she said, half amused, half chiding. He nodded, contrite. And you stunned me. By the time we finished talking, I couldn't imagine leaving. She patted his hand. I'm glad you stayed. In that moment, Mark realized the depth of what he felt. The woman he nearly dismissed had become someone he cherished. He remembered the old bet with a grimace, but was oddly thankful for it. Without that nudge, he might never have glimpsed beyond his superficial preferences. Life had a strange way of teaching him lessons. On a crisp weekend morning, Mark suggested a stroll by the river. They walked side by side, the wind nipping at their cheeks, discussing future plans in casual, open terms. Sarah revealed she was scouting small locations for her bookstore cafe dream, hoping to launch in a year or two if she saved enough. Mark listened supportively, brightening whenever she got excited about potential decor or events she could hold. You really think it's a good idea? She asked, eyes sparkling with hope. He brushed his gloved hand over hers. I think it's brilliant, exactly the kind of place I'd love to hang out. She squeezed his hand back. That means a lot coming from you, Mr. Finance Guy. He smirked. I've learned finances mean nothing if you're not living your passion. Pausing, he looked at her. Yours is to build that cozy space. Mine as well. Maybe it's to stop living by other people's standards. She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. They watched the water flow beneath the bridge. Each had grown, changed by their bond. For Mark, that meant discarding his obsession with surface-level perfection. For Sarah, it meant trusting that someone could genuinely care about her beyond a fleeting curiosity. Their story, born out of misguided assumptions and a nudge from a meddling friend, became a testament to deeper connection. Mark faced down the reality that attraction was more than appearance, and discovered that authenticity was far more captivating than any superficial ideal. Sarah overcame the lingering fear that she'd always be the plain girl, learning that someone could cherish her precisely for who she was. At long last, the memory of that bet faded, replaced by mutual respect and honest affection. They teased each other about it from time to time. Sarah reminded Mark how easily she could have dismissed him, and Mark joked about how blind he'd been. But the pain of the betrayal no longer stung. In its wake, they had built something real. On a cozy evening at Sarah's apartment, as they sipped hot cocoa and read side by side, she lost in a new manuscript, he half watching a sports highlight on mute. Mark looked over at her. She glanced up, eyebrows raised in question. He just smiled softly. She returned the smile, warmth filling her chest. I'm glad it turned out this way, he said, voice quiet. Me too, she murmured. In that moment, words weren't necessary. They both knew how chance, a little bit of misguided bravado, and an unexpected spark had led them there. Their story, once overshadowed by false assumptions, had blossomed into a bond they never saw coming. If you found Mark and Sarah's story meaningful, remember that the most genuine connections can arise from the most unlikely circumstances. Stay open to surprises. Sometimes, when expectations fall away, true understanding emerges. For more heartfelt stories of love, change, and second chances, subscribe to soul-stirring stories. Let each tale remind you that real beauty often lies beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look deeper.